Now, the book ends with the last couple of decades of Woody cinematic output. Uh, you have it divided into a last two eras. What are the two eras? And give me a film, pro or con, that you think is the most representative, the best, the most interesting. What critics, whichever one jumps right out at you. So, what are the last two Woody eras that you tackle?
The next two eras are 1993 until 2004. So that's the films between Bullets Over Broadway, no, Manhattan Murder Mystery, and Melinda and Melinda. And then I go from Match Point 2005 up until 2013's Blue Jasmine.
Okay.
And looking at the first time period, the film that I probably want to talk about the most is Celebrity. This is because this is a film that has been pretty much ignored. It's been neglected, and in many ways, it's just been much more panned even than Stardust Memories or Another Woman or similar films. It has not necessarily had this kind of revitalization like some other films might have, and I wouldn't call it a great film. It's not up to par to his best work, but at the very least, I would argue that it is an excellent film. It's an excellent film for the very reasons that people deride it for. So, for example, you have you have the character of Simon through what's his name, Kenneth Branagh, and he's been derided as this kind of a really poor Woody Allen stand-in. That he's merely doing the Woody Allen shtick in a way that Woody Allen himself would not be able to do. But this is kind of the point. If you look at his appearance, it's clearly more handsome than Woody Allen. He looks more manly than Woody Allen. And he is somebody that would much more easily fit into this kind of celebrity life than Woody Allen would. If you see, for example, the flirt scenes that he has with the various women, if you see him sort of going around with different models, these are not things that Woody Allen would be able to pull off himself. Because if Woody were to do it, it would just look like mere comedy. It would look like mere comedy because here's this nebbish that has these glasses and that just looks so awkward and acts so awkward. There is no sense of genuine romance. There is no sense that this is a realistic move for this kind of human being to make. But with the Woody Allen stand-in, as he's being called, he does a very good job. He's very realistic in that role. And these are all pluses. This is not the negative that it's been made out to be. And a close viewing of the film without allowing Woody Allen to enter into this universe, I think most people will come away with that sort of interpretation.
Yeah, the best film I think from that period I would put as Sweet and Lowdown. I think Sean Penn, who's not really my favorite actor, but he has given some terrific performances. He's one of the most hot and cold actors out there. I think he's terrific as the guitarist, and Samantha Morton in that film. It's one of the few non-speaking roles in the post-silent era that is really affecting. But most of those films, I think, are very small films. Let's go on to the most recent era and give me one film from that era that stands out and why for you.
In the most recent era, there's only really two disagreements I would have critically with kind of the consensus that's developed. On the one hand, you have this extreme praise for Midnight in Paris. I consider Midnight in Paris to be, a stylish, but for the most part, fairly mediocre film with some pretty bad acting all around. But that's forgettable, and I think I could forgive that kind of thing. But the one thing that is far harder to forgive is the kind of panning that Cassandra's Dream has received.
Yeah.
Now, Cassandra's Dream is a film that is probably slightly, even if it's ever so slightly, better than Match Point, a film that has been praised. And it's great in a number of respects. It has a number of really wonderful script inversions. The acting all around is pretty good. Not everybody's on the same level, but all around, say it's pretty good. The characterizations are both realistic and perhaps deeper than they have been given credit for. So, for example, you have I believe it's Howard, who's the uncle of the two brothers. You sort of see him as this kind of rich businessman who is aloof and standoffish, and perhaps is involved in things that he's not supposed to be in. And for the most part, he seems pretty calm. Suddenly, though, there's a storm that passes. The two brothers go into some foliage with their uncle, and he completely goes nuts. He starts to take on a far darker tone. He starts to yell. He starts to do things where you finally see the composure that he probably has spent such a long time cultivating, as the proper and prim businessman. It's now coming undone, and you see his true colors. And despite this fact, in Hollywood, you would normally have this close up in his face. Instead, you actually see him be obscured by the leaves. That is sort of almost dismissive of the things that he might be saying. And eventually, when the two brothers say, "No, we're not going to do it," they're sitting around and they're feeling guilty about the fact that they're essentially saying no to murder.
Yeah.
They're so insecure. They're, at least Ian is such an obvious social climber that he feels guilty over saying no to murder. This is the level of people that we're dealing with, and this is a scripting moment that is so easy to miss. You might look at it and say like, oh, they're just kind of bullshitting about whether they should do it or not. But no, they're essentially revealing who they really are by these emotions that really are at odds. And they may be emotions that most people might experience under these circumstances, but to look more deeply, they're emotions that they should not be experiencing. And this is a clue as to what will happen in the rest of the film. And there's so many little moments like this. I'm just covering a couple. My review covers most of them. But there's so many moments like this that really bring this film into a much higher level than it's been being credit for.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that in the last 20 or so years, the post golden era, golden age Woody, is that he goes back and he sort of scavenges some of the greater films. We didn't mention in the golden age films, Crimes and Misdemeanors, which I think blows away, Dostoevsky. I mean, you talked about Love and Death, the engagement with the Dostoevskian themes. That's again right up there with Stardust Memories and Another Woman is one of his all-time great films and one of the great American films. And both Matchpoint and Cassandra's Dreams are sort of the serious side of that film, minus the Woody digression in Crimes and Misdemeanors. And they're both lesser takes, but both of them, are films that I think, are far better than a lot of, other films. And I think this is one of the problems with critics generally, is that you can get spoiled. My wife Jessica and I, when we write, sometimes when we read our own stuff, and not to blow our own horns, but what the fuck, there's such an expectation of quality that when you do something a little different, there's sometimes a letdown. And I think with Woody Allen, people got spoiled with his 15-year run from 77 to 92. He did, I don't know, maybe 12, 13, 14 films in that period, and maybe only 3 or 4 were mediocre films, like A Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy and 1 or 2 others that slipped my mind, Alice or whatnot. But these were such, I mean, it's a run that's almost unprecedented in American film. But anyway, let's wrap up this section, and in our next section, let's focus on you and your life up until this point, and then once we get the basic biographical facts, we'll talk about art in general. So stay tuned. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Alex and his life. Where and when were you born, Alex?
I was born in Belarus in 1987. In a city that was only a couple of hundred miles from the Chernobyl power plant in the Ukraine. So this obviously has relevance to me, because the main reason why my family ended up moving to America was because of this event. Had it not been that sort of impetus, perhaps I'd not be here, and I'd not be writing, among other things. And since that time, I've been living in New York City, mostly in Brooklyn and Queens, depending on the year.
So that was actually the USSR during the time. I often asked people when I was doing my written interviews about a cultural touchstone in their life. Obviously, the Chernobyl event happened before you were born. give me something from your earliest youth, maybe your first 5 or 10 years once you got to America, something that, like some people remember JFK being shot, the Challenger explosion, or even if it's something on a personal level that directed you towards art. Give me one event that is seminal in your life.
Um, I normally didn't pay attention to the outside world during that time period, but the one event that I still really remember and that I knew was very different to me compared to most people was when I was about 4 or 5. I was still living in Belarus, and there was this kid that I knew. I guess he was my friend or perhaps my acquaintance, and he had a toy that I really, really wanted. I don't remember what that toy was. I don't remember what it looked like, and I don't really remember why I wanted it, but I just knew that I really, really wanted it. So I got myself in a situation where I knew I'd be able to steal it from him, not be able to steal it in a way that I'd never be caught. And sure enough, I stole it and I was never caught. And immediately I had it in my hands, and for the first second I thought, wow, this thing that I wanted for so long, I finally have it in my hands. But the next second, it was a complete letdown because I immediately thought, yes, I have it in my hands. I have this thing that I really wanted with me, but it can never really, really be mine. It doesn't belong to me in a deeper sense. It has, its own history. It has its own context. And I got it in a way that ensures that it will never really be mine. And I don't understand how other people could steal things or take credit for things or do anything outside of their own really genuine self. And
Yeah.
I knew at the time that this was a pretty different mentality for most people, and this was only reinforced over time. So I can't say that I was somebody back then that had a whole lot of intellect or all these interests in reading and books and art. I didn't. But I did have a set of feelings, I did have a set of sensitivities that pointed me to something greater and deeper that at the time was merely a promise, and eventually I was able to execute that. But for a while, it was merely that. It was the sensitivities, it was the feelings, and these are the kinds of memories that I recall the most. Everybody has physical memories. I don't really consider them that important, but some of these, I guess, monumental sensitivities. This is what really sticks with me.
What? Give me a childhood hero if you had any. And did you have any career goals as a kid? Or I know I didn't even think of becoming a poet until I was 19 and wanted to impress a girl. How about you?
Can't say that I had any heroes. Again, I didn't really pay attention to the wider cultural world. Part of it was, for a while I didn't speak any English, so it was hard for me to pay attention to any of that. On the other hand, I was just kind of stuck in my own neighborhood. So the closest thing that I've had to a hero was, ironically and very strangely now that I say it, they were the Hasidic Jews in my neighborhood. I lived in a very, very Jewish community, and they were ultra Orthodox. And for the longest time, I would look at them and I would think, they have such perfect families, but beyond having such perfect families, they have such a rich spirituality. They have such an austerity. They have such I guess, such an esoteric eccentricity that I really wanted for myself. Because although my family was Christian and although I considered myself religious for a time, I also knew that nobody that I knew that was Christian was ever truly serious about it, at least not like these Jews. So I've always had these really strong spiritual drives, this strong desire to be like them, despite the fact that it would go against everything that I grew up, feeling and thinking. There was that strong spiritual edge that was always with me. And eventually, even when I completely let go of religion and consider it silly, I now see that my drive for art was merely a sublimation of this kind of spirituality. I get the same feeling that I got back then watching them walk during a snowstorm on the Sabbath, just walking through the streets that now have dissolved with snow. I get the same feeling then as I do now when I create a book, when I finish something that I think is wonderful, or when I read a great poem or whatnot, see a great film. So it's been a sublimation. I didn't have heroes, but I had people I wanted to be. And although I never became those people, I think I did well for myself anyway.
Do you currently consider yourself an agnostic or an atheist? And let's not get into a deep religious discussion, just agnostic or atheist.
Atheist, small
Atheist.
a, but atheist.
Where did you go to high school and where did you go to college?
I went to high school. I spent a couple years in New Jersey, but the only high school of real memory to me is Abraham Lincoln High School in Coney Island.
Uh-huh.
It was a I didn't really think of it as this back then, but I guess now when I speak to people now, they say it's a really, really terrible school, and I guess in some ways it was very overcrowded, very violent, a lot of bad shit happening left and right. But I really enjoyed my time. I always skipped class. I never really went, but the teachers knew me. They would mark me as present in the attendance, and I just sort of did whatever I wanted, which at that time was politics. I was really into politics, and high school let that be an outlet for me.
How about college?
College, I went to the Macaulay Honors College in the CUNY system. There's a school in the Upper East Side called Hunter College, and that was my base school for 4.5 years.
Did any college professors stand out, pro or con? You don't have to name them, but was there any guiding influence, or was college just something you just had to get through?
I was very excited starting college for the first couple of months, but then very quickly I realized it would just be complete drudgery. So, as far as memories of the professors, the only ones that really stood out in a positive sense were those that had a very kind of hands-up approach. So, we would be given, for example, texts by Shakespeare, or we'd be given, books by somebody else, and we'd sit there, we'd read, and we'd merely talk about the plays or the books or whatnot. We talk about what worked, what didn't, and these are discussions that you could have. These are normal human discussions. On the con side was pretty much everybody else. The professors that would assign very silly, esoteric readings and stuff from academic journals. Professors that would try to get into fights with me, or perhaps would try to have me, I guess, bow down to whatever it is they were teaching. I remember one professor in particular. She it was a graduate class, and it was about Black postmodernism. We had a couple of great books. We had to read Oxford Entail by Charles Johnson. We had to read Middle Passage. So there was some great material there, but for the most part, we had some pretty shitty books to read, whether it's poetry by Clarence Major, or stuff by Ishmael Reed, stuff by Toni Morrison. And every single time that we were supposed to have a class discussion, I would be the only one that was prepared, because instead of merely kind of letting her set the tone, I would have my book open, I would have pages highlighted, I would have passages highlighted. I would say, but professor, look at this passage, look how poorly it's written, look at all these cliches, look how structurally inept it is, look at this, look at that. And she never really wanted to talk about it, but she would passive aggressively remark about me to the rest of the class in a way that as if I couldn't hear. And she was the only professor that tried to really fuck me over with my grades.
Let's move on to your family.
Yeah.
Your parents. You didn't know your father, am I correct?
No, I didn't know my father.
And your mother recently died a year or two ago. Was No, she was not an artist. What did she do?
Well, as far as my mother's concerned, it's a pretty simple thing. She's led a very private and anonymous life, and this wasn't merely a personal choice. On some level, it became a survival strategy. I have not fully come to terms with her life and her existence and her way of doing things. And this is something I'm going to have to do on my own terms eventually over time, in the only way that I really can, which is artistically. So I'm going to leave that question open-ended now. Eventually, I will tell everything,
Okay.
and more than everything in time.
And you do have one sibling, a twin, in fact, an identical twin. He's also into the arts. What is he currently doing? Is he a writer as well?
He's interested in painting, but more recently he's been trying to do some, I guess, mixed media stuff relating with painting and creating video games and other, I guess, electronic-based material.
And you recently got married this year to a Korean woman. Your
Yeah.
wife, she is Korean American, though, correct? Is she
Well, she
also an
was,
immigrant to the
she was
U.S.?
an immigrant. She was born in Seoul, and she came here, I think, younger than I was, maybe a 4 or 5. I don't really remember. But she came from Seoul, and we grew up not too far from each other. I grew up in Brooklyn. She grew up in New Jersey. Ironically, I hated New Jersey. She loved it, and that was we grew up under very very different circumstances, to put
And
it
sh
mildly.
and she's a musician, and her family, and doesn't she come from a family of artists? But she hasn't, from what I remember, she's not like currently pursuing. She doesn't work in any like symphony, but she's teaching music. What is her status in that regard?
She's teaching music, different instruments, but she does pursue music in the sense of she has a number of groups that she rehearses with, and they sometimes put on events. It's not necessarily in the professional sense. It's not for money, but this is something she enjoys, and I mean, it's something that keeps the mind sharp. It keeps you doing something productive and at the very least interesting. So she does that in her free time on top of the teaching at various schools.
Yeah. Last question biographically, and let's just end this section. You mentioned a bit about your youth and your first book that you wrote, which was a novel. What was it? Kensington. What was this
Yeah.
called?
A few streets more to Kensington, and Kensington is the neighborhood that I grew up in Brooklyn.
Right, and just give a one minute or so idea of where you grew up, because I know I grew up in a New York that was sort of the mean streets, to use the Scorsese film, the mean streets kind of New York. What was your New York like? Woody Allen had the New York of radio days. I had the mean streets. What was the Sheremet '90s to early O's New York?
Well, it was a very different time from both. I grew up in a very, very heavily Hasidic Jewish community that, because of the fact that they were so different, it established a kind of, I guess, romance and nostalgia in my mind. But at the same time, there were things going on in that neighborhood that only those that were not Hasidic Jews would know about, because we were actually kind of in the real world. Across the street from me, I had a church that eventually became a brothel and a crack house. So for a couple of years, we'd see pimps and johns coming in and out. We'd see drug deals, and this was literally like a 20 or 30-second walk from my front door. I had friends from all over the place. It wasn't necessarily a tough place or anything like that, but it was a very, very interesting and diverse place to grow up. Part of that being because we were kind of the first generation to grow up in two worlds. One was in the streets and playing past midnight and skipping class and doing the kinds of things that are very typical of city kids. On the other hand, we also grew up on the internet. We grew up in media. We grew up in places that kind of played with human feelings and emotions and intellects that have been unprecedented. And I think that has also had a pretty lasting impact on how I view the world.
All right, in our next section that's coming up, we're going to talk with Alex about his views on life, art, beyond Woody Allen, although we may touch back on the book and whatnot. So that's coming up. In this section, we're going to talk with Alex. We're going to sort of freeform a little bit. And I had a list of questions that I sometimes asked most of the people that I did the written interviews with. One of the questions I asked is a sort of standard one. One of the books, some of the books that influenced me when I was growing up was Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Lauren Isley's All the Strange Hours, his autobiography, a book called Art and Physics by Leonard Shlain that helped me understand modern art a bit, Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn novel. Give me one or two books or any other works that influenced you, just briefly. You don't have to go in depth, but just give me a brief précis of what influenced you.
I became interested in reading fairly late in life. I was 16 years old. I just moved to a new neighborhood in Brooklyn where there was a library right across the street from me. So I entered and I saw this book on the shelves called Soul on Ice by the Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver. And I checked it out, and it was the first book that I read very quickly. I read it in about, I think, 1 or 2 days. And I remember when I finished it, just sort of lying back in bed and thinking, there's no way that my life could be the same after finishing this book. And it was not something I could really understand intellectually, but it was something that was very, very strong within my head. And from that point on, I became interested in politics, not so much the arts, but I became interested in politics and reading in general, perhaps a little bit of writing here and there. And from that point on, this is really what kind of set me on my trajectory. As far as art books goes, I was very influenced by County Cullen's poetry. I remember reading a lot of poetry during that time period that really kind of stuck out to me as being malformed and poorly worded, among other problems. But here was a poet that, although he talked about the deeper topical things, the more kind of, I guess, stereotypically black things, he did it in a way that was seemingly at odds with a lot of the styles of that kind of content. And that meaning it was very classical in form, and it was just very well written. I was, like I mentioned earlier, very influenced by his poem Heritage. So as far as the arts goes, I'd say it's probably County Cullen that first turned me on to writing in general.
Okay, let's talk about art, and we've touched upon criticism. Uh, what do you think is one of the things that in bad art or art that fails or doesn't succeed as well as it should? Uh, what would you think is the one thing, and just briefly, that that is contained in all kind of bad art? Is it all art being political? Is it the objective subjective thing? Is it the use of cliches? We've touched upon some of these, or something totally different.
I'd say that, and this kind of encompasses all these things. I'd say that bad art, the one thing that bad art really has in common with itself is just the fact that it tries to ape reality as opposed to show reality. Now, reality is obviously something that is implicit within art. It's something that is necessary for good art to function, but you can't simply take a video camera, stick it outside your window, turn it on for 12 hours, and say you made a great film. It doesn't work like that. You need to be able to take reality, you need to be able to concentrate it into a smaller form, and this is what the viewer and the consumer needs to see. It's sort of like if reality is a funnel and you see all this stuff going into the top end, what comes out needs to be art. This concentrate of things, suddenly this water or whatever else that's kind of all over the place. Now it's being concentrated, now it has order, now it has form. And this is reality in the sense of not being aped, it's merely being shown. And great art shows reality, but it does not simply ape it. That's, reality apes reality, not art. The two things are distinct.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was talking with my wife Jessica a week or so ago about something, and I'll mention it in a second. Two things that stick out to me that a lot of people fall into the trap of. I was recently arguing just earlier this morning, over the last couple of days, with this young girl in her 20s, around your age, on a chat room, and we were talking about something that happened on a television show, and we got into talking about, I forget what the subject matter was, but I had used a phrase where I had said something like, and just I won't get into the specifics, but just to paraphrase, it said. It was using a term sort of similar to like a glass being half empty or half full, and them representing the two things. And the girl had convolutedly thought that I was using a double negative, and I was talking about the state of the thing. And I was thinking to myself, my God, here's a girl who doesn't even understand what she's talking about, and yet she's trying to school me on grammar. And then the other thing, not only the fact that a lot of people who engage art don't understand the basic tools of art, much less the art itself. But people also have this solecism that art always has to be about them. It goes to the thing about I need to be pleased, the like and dislike thing. And I'll give you an example. Recently, you've read, I did this obituary. I've done a couple of obituaries, one on James Emanuel, a great American poet who died last year. But I recently did this obituary about this woman that I had known and been semi-involved with a quarter century ago. Her name was Maggie Estep, and she was a well-known New Eurekan poet. And in it, I had sent it around to a lot of people I knew, and I had this one small passage, a couple of sentences about this other woman writer that I'd known. And when I had sent the piece to her to read, she got all upset about something, and I won't get into what it was, but about something I had written. And this was like a 5,500 word piece, and 30 words of that mentioned her and the similarity of this stepwoman to her. And just to quell her, I removed the two sentences or so, and yet she just sort of blew me off or whatnot. And so to me, I've always found those kinds of things. The one that people just don't have the equipment to really engage art or even higher ideas of philosophy. And the second, if they do, like this other writer woman who did, they don't them because it's all about themselves. Have you ever experienced that?
I mean, you see it all the time, whether it's probably the most concentrated form of this that I experienced was in college, either talking to professors or fellow students. You know, people get into the arts, people get into various things, but they don't necessarily know what they're stepping into. They think they know, they think they have a good idea of what's what, but realistically, they're interested in things that are very extraneous to the art itself. You know, this is just a very common occurrence, and I think even beyond art, in most facets of life, this is sort of what people do. They step into things without necessarily being thoughtful about what they're even attempting.
Yeah. Um, what do you think? What do you think about the approach to art? Do you have an ontological approach to art? Would you say? Do you approach art as in a more pragmatic sense? And whatever way you approach it, what are the pros and cons of that?
Um, I don't approach it in the sense of identity too much. I approach it primarily as a means of offering a service. On some days, there are things that I would rather be doing than art. You know, one of my favorite things is just sort of lie back and read, not necessarily have to respond to anything, not necessarily have to engage with anything more deeply than within my own head. But I feel like by some odd combination of events and luck and whatever else, I'm somebody that developed, that had a talent and was able to develop it. So right now, my main concern is how am I going to make this talent relevant to the rest of the world? I think most artists, what they really need to start doing is they need to start expanding beyond themselves, and they need to really start challenging themselves. Recently, a few days ago, I was in this poetry library in New York City, and I was just struck by the number of poetry books that I read in that sitting that were just so small. I don't even mean in terms of just quality. You know, they weren't good writing for the most part, but they were very small in idea. They were very small in ambition. They were very small in what they were trying to do. They were just very small minded. You look at it, and it's almost as if ants could have art, this is the sort of thing that they would do. And I don't know what it comes down to, but I think a lot of it might be either people's inability, or more often than not, I guess people being scared of going any more deeply. So I think when people create art, they really need to stretch themselves. They need to try different media. They need to try different genres. They need to try different styles. This is the only way that you're going to grow. This is the only way you're going to challenge yourself. Because if you think of art as offering a service, this goes beyond merely being able to please yourself, or doing the kind of work that you yourself want to read. This goes into the territory of what is the kind of work that the world needs? What is the kind of work that people will really benefit from? And you don't have to necessarily be so mechanical or so specific about this, but if you really try to be as great as you can, and you try to be consistent, and you try to do this in as many different ways as possible, you know, those sorts of questions really take care of themselves in the end.
Yeah, let's take a break after this next question that you answer, and then I got a couple of more questions in this vein. You mentioned earlier sublimation, and I don't know if you're familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas of sublimation and greatness. That you need to sublimate sort of
Yeah.
the inner part of yourself in order to produce something. I think Nietzsche got balled up a little bit in thinking that he conflated greatness with ethical goodness to a certain extent. But if you're familiar with Nietzsche's idea of sublimation, and the more I'd say logical dictionary definition of sublimation, do you find anything relevant to that and art let's make this the last question of this section.
Well, I mean, I feel like with the world in general, we've seen in the last few thousand years, there's this very clear trajectory into a more kind of abstract way of living. Yes, we will always have our physical bodies, and yes, we will always have to deal with at least some base concerns. But after a while, we have better and more complex societies and deeper and greater art simply because there are so many drives that human beings have. There are so many instincts, there's so many things that people could do that they end up sublimating into something deeper. The example of me kind of letting go of religion and being able to sublimate spirituality into art, that's one example. If I didn't have this moment of impetus, if I didn't have something that was driving me somewhere, if I didn't have that sort of feeling, I probably would be a lot less inclined to do this kind of work. I want to, in the end, be content with the fact that I lived my life in a meaningful way according to my purpose and ability. So I think with any kind of art, you're definitely sublimating something, whether it's Nietzsche's ideas of sublimating, I guess, hero-like qualities and violence into something better or whatnot, or whether it's something as simple as sacrificing a small part of yourself to actually be a greater artist. I think there's very much a lot of relevance in these kinds of concepts as far as how they relate to art.
Okay, we will now take a break here, and when we get back, we'll continue a little bit on this discussion. We're going to ask a few questions of Alex some of them that I asked in some of my classic written interviews, and there was a question, one of the questions that I remember a lot of people, I probably gotten the most emails just saying, what the fuck, was a question that I asked quite often in my early interviews, and one was to Daniel Dennett. He had appeared on a Charlie Rose show back during the turn of the century about who was the most influential person in history. And I had gone off and said that it was amazing that on this panel of supposed experts, no one had mentioned Genghis Khan. And the reason I bring it up is because Khan was an interesting character. He was not, I mean, he was a mass murderer, but he was also someone who is at forefront of developing society in terms of laws, in terms of religious freedom, and a lot of other positive things. But he was totally neglected, and to me this showed how a lot of intellectuals like Dennett, was even someone like Richard Dawkins, who I just shake my head over sometimes, miss the big picture for the little thing. Just in your own idea, and it can be from art or whatnot, who would you posit as one of the most influential people of either the last 1,000 years or the last 2,000 years, and why?
As far as the influence that actually affects people most deeply and in the most immediate sense, I'd probably agree with some historical figures such as Genghis Khan. But I do think those kinds of questions, they really relate to most influential up to this point.
Yeah.
I think if you look at some artists, perhaps some classical artists or far more recent ones like Herman Melville or Walt Whitman, you'll probably find that over time they will have much more even historical impact than some of these other people might. Because, as you've pointed out elsewhere, Genghis Khan, he was not a solitary being. There were probably many other people just waiting historically and contextually to be Genghis Khan. There's many people waiting to be conquerors. There's many people waiting to bring democracy to the world. There's many people waiting to do very physical, immediate things, because if you see such an empty niche, it becomes very easy to fill. But when it comes to artistic concerns and more abstract concerns, these niches are not so easy to fill. These gaps are there, and it's only after a confluence of some fairly unique things that they end up being filled. So I think probably in the long term you will have people like Walt Whitman and Melville and perhaps Lao Tzu with the Tao Te Ching influencing history in far more profound ways over time. It's not things that we could really measure right now. It's not things that we could so easily think of and articulate now, but I think in the long term this is really where we're headed.
Yeah, I call it all the time when I talk with my wife, and I have to reassure her about great art and whatnot getting out there. I call it the opening, the ever widening cone of greatness. Is that greatness always expands? If you look at the books that are getting dusty on shelves from the 1880s or the 1900s on old used bookshelves, these were people who were the Danielle Steeles and they were the Dave Eggerses of those days, and they're forgotten because their work has no relevance past a small, relatively small group of people. Whereas the people who have real influence are those that are bottlenecks. Whitman, you can dislike Whitman's poems. I think his greatness in his greatest poems are inarguable. The 20, 30, 40, however many great poems you want to argue he had. But he was someone who fundamentally changed poetry. Now, poetry doesn't change things as much as, say, Lee Harvey Oswald shooting John F. Kennedy in the short run. But 500 years from now, John F. Kennedy's being shot, is not going to seem as big as the art that is going to come from the world view that shifted with what Whitman did. And someone like Genghis Khan, of course, I agree to a certain extent with what you said, but on the other hand, there's the old thing about George Washington being the first. I think it was said he was the first human leader who was elected who ever stepped down from a position, and I could be wrong about that. And in the same way, Genghis Khan was a ruthless conqueror, but he was the first one to have a sort of vision. So, he's not Attila the Hun. He's not Alexander the Great in that sense. He was someone who was, I think, a different kind of person. But it's interesting because I asked this question because when I asked Daniel Dennett of it, he had like a flippant little one sentence thing, and I got so many emails that were like, why did he blow that? That's a great question. And then I know a couple of times I've seen people online who've written about my written interviews saying that it was a great reply by Dennett, but it showed an utter vacuity from this guy whose career is about intellect. And you see these TED Talks and whatnot where a lot of these intellects go on and they sort of preen on this or that, and in reality they're just aping a lot of things. But anyway, I'm not going to preach. Let me
Well,
give you
let me just
yeah.
elaborate on something I said earlier. So, as far as physical influence goes, with Genghis Khan and that sort of vision, yes, he's. I consider him somebody influential as far as making this shift in mentality as far as what government can be, what it could do for people, and vice versa. But at the same time, I think there will be some point in human history where physical concerns and revolutions that move physical things, they will not be as important. On the other hand, abstract concerns and things like poetry and art and whatnot, they will continue to expand, they will continue to deepen in a way that the more base concerns, they'll eventually hit some kind of baseline. They'll eventually hit some sort of point of stasis. They might, kind of be nudged here or there, but for the most part, I anticipate real revolutions in humanity, and I mean 4 or 5 or more centuries on, to be primarily of an abstract sort. So there will be a certain point where Genghis Khan will cease to influence human history. But I think when it comes to art and some of these other concerns, such things will not cease. They will just only deepen in time.
Now let me ask a final question, and we'll close this section. And then we'll talk about how we met and your relationship to Cosmoetica and how that got you into doing this book. This is a question that I asked a couple of the philosophers, and Steven Pinker famously dodged it. I've always had the idea that most people are placeholders, and this doesn't mean that they should be, shoveled off to ovens and fried or whatnot. But there are only a small, it's sort of a version of the great man theory of history. People like a Walt Whitman or some of these other people that we've mentioned sort of kick and drag the rest of society towards them, towards the future and towards what's better. And most other people are content. Their contentment is just passing on their genes, and it's sort of like, well, I'm going to sacrifice for my child so he can sacrifice for his child so she can sacrifice for her child and whatnot, and it becomes an absurdity. And so the question that I asked Pinker was, the old question of, if there's a burning building and if somehow we could metaphysically get all of the works of Shakespeare or all of the paintings of Picasso or all of the writings of Darwin and just put them in one thing and blow them up, and you could stop that, or you could stop, say, Joe the plumber, not the political guy, but Bill the plumber, say, from dying. Which would you do? And of course, most philosophers and most people want to be the good person and say, well, I choose the human being. But for me, the guy who's maybe a good, hardworking, tax-paying citizen who's a tailor, a tinker, a beggar man, thief, is not worth the overall of a great artist's output, or even a great scientist. Although I do value art over science, because you remove Melville, there's no Moby Dick. If you remove Darwin, there's Wallace right next to him that's going to fill that void. Given that thing, if there was some metaphysical way that either all the works and ideas of a great artist, Shakespeare or Picasso, are destroyed, or saving an individual life, what is your take on that?
Well, in the abstract sense, I think it's very clear that when you set up this kind of scale, it's obvious that the works of Shakespeare or the works of a other great artist or whoever, it's clear that they're more important than the life of a janitor. It's going to have far deeper effects upon history and so on and so forth. However, if this is going to be a question that's personally asked of me, in that situation, I know that instinct will kick in for me. I will not be able to dodge that sort of emotion, and I will end up saving the janitor over, over the works of Shakespeare. This may not be the right choice as far as historical necessity is concerned, but it's going to be something that I would end up doing, and I get the feeling that most people end up doing. Now, I think in the specific sense, this has some problems, but if you look at kind of the mass sense of human behavior as it exists now as opposed to 2,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 years ago, I think the net effect of this, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that people are willing to make the sorts of choices that have a more that would have this kind of impact in the long term. Eventually, we won't be in these kinds of situations to make these sorts of choices. But I think that for myself, as for most people, again, instinct will kick in, emotion will take over, and we'll end up saving the janitor.
Yeah, I probably would too. It reminds me, just to tie it back to Woody Allen, it reminds me of the Interiors scene where they go to see a play, and there are, I think there's some people who are terrorists that in the play want to kill off X amount of people, and the character played by Diane Keaton, the poet sister, Renata, says something, well, who are these people that would die? They're just abstracts, how, and it goes back to like the old thing, if you woke up tomorrow and you heard on CNN that China just off the face of the earth with 1.3 billion people or whatnot, would that affect you? And no, it wouldn't really affect me in any great day-to-day sense, but it's just interesting because a lot of people, getting back to I told you this girl that I was arguing with who didn't understand even the basics of grammar, they don't even in their daily life confront these kind of issues. They don't even think about it. They're just thinking about, well, is my DVR going to work and tape my favorite cable show?
Well, hopefully there will be no more Shakespeare.
Okay. We'll go on to the next section. Okay, Alex, let us talk briefly about how you and I came into contact, because ultimately, just speaking of things and the butterfly effect, your book basically sprung out of your initially contacting me some years back, which sprung out of my starting my website Cosmoetica, which sprung out of decisions made years earlier. When and how did you contact me, or did you contact my wife Jessica? I don't even recall.
I ended up contacting you, and I was actually, I wouldn't say that I was a reader of Cosmoetica, but when you're serious about art and you're serious about poetry today, I think it's inevitable that when you do research, say, in Walt Whitman, or you want to read something about Yeats, or you want to read something about contemporary poets, or whatever else it may be, it's inevitable that you're going to come across Cosmoetica. And I know this because I remember from like 2004, 2005 on, when I first became interested in such things, whenever I would do research, I would keep coming across your essays over and over and over again. And eventually, it seemed to me that you sort of knew what you were talking about. And around 2007, I was, I think, 19 or 20 years old. I was interested in writing poetry at this point already, and every single thing that I had written to that point was pretty much incomplete. I never really had a fully completed poem. That's because I would always abandon them before they were able to satisfy me. I just didn't know whether I was writing anything that was good or bad. So since you seem to have some grasp of these things, I decided to send you a poem that I just finished. And I remember it was a poem that I thought, you know, here's going to be kind of like my final attempt after these like years and years of trying and not really knowing what I was doing. If Dan says that, you know, this shit sucks, I'm probably just going to give it up and do something that I'm better at instead of, you know, trying to fight against the inevitable. So I sent it to you, and I remember your response was that it was an excellent poem. And I remember one of the key things was that you didn't tell me why it was an excellent poem. You had, I guess, some general suggestions, but for the most part, I was glad that you didn't tell me why, because it means that I was able to look through this poem on my own, and I was able to decide whether or not it was good writing, and I was able to allow this to enter into me both through instinct and also intellectually. And from that point on, I figured, okay, so if this is an example of good writing, how can I replicate this in more writing and also be able to do it in very different ways while keeping the crux of what makes good art the same. So from that point on, we were in contact. So this was since the very end of 2007, beginning of 2008.
Okay. Now, as far as my writings on Cosmoetica at the time, and still, I have essays that I've continued to write. I had poetries. I had critical essays about poetry. Which do you think influenced you more, my poems then, or the criticism? Because obviously, in case people haven't figured it out, or if anyone's read my criticism, you are very much in the same kind of vein in an approach. I won't use a term like school because I don't want there to ever be a Schneider school of anything. But so, what was the poetry, was the creative writing, or the criticism itself more important to you?
I think definitely at the beginning it was the criticism, and that's because, at least for me, when I started out reading poetry, you know, there were names that you could immediately read and appreciate and understand and, you know, be able to intellectually engage with, and those that were kind of further afield. So when I first started, you know, County Cullen was an easy poet to understand. Besides the fact that he was a great poet, you know, he was somebody I could easily engage with. Same with Philip Larkin, William Butler Yeats. These are people that you could engage with immediately. When I read your poems, you know, I saw all your claims about being a great poet and whatnot, but I didn't understand poems really at that point. People like Rilke or Wallace Stevens and others, they were completely off limits to me. And I put your poetry in that category. So at the beginning, all that I could do was simply read your criticism and think about whether or not it made sense, because I was not able to see whether it applied to your own writing. I was only able to take your claims for what they were and be able to play with them intellectually. This is how I started in my life. I started with ideas and politics and evaluating things like that that had nothing to do with art. So in a sense, I almost evaluated your claims independent of art, and eventually I saw they made sense. So the essay that I'd say was probably most influential was your essay on Robinson, Jeffers, and Meter, because for a very long time, I was one of these geeky type.
Oh, hold. Yeah, you just froze up. You were one of those geeky types. I'm sorry, you just froze up.
I was one of those geeky types that was very interested in Latin and Greek and,
Yeah.
you know, the minutiae of meter. And when I would do my own writing, I would try to make sure like it's fitting into a certain metrical pattern. And I thought there was something very odd about this, especially when I was reading John Donne's poetry and I saw how he completely violated meter. But I thought at the same time, but hey, this is a great poet. I know he's a great poet, but he's violating me, or how can this mesh with my own views? And eventually, reading your essay, the stuff that was instinct for me, was finally articulated elsewhere, and I was able to do something with it. So yeah,
Yeah,
it was
that,
criticism that turned me on.
there's the old saying that to become good at something you have to learn the rules, but to become great you have to learn how to break them and when to break them and why to break them. And I know I was just asking Jessica some questions about grammar because oftentimes I've got this sort of convective memory and I can't always pull things out right away. And but she's very good at saying, oh, that's a this kind of clause, that's a
Mhm.
adjectival clause or something. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, but I know instinctively what it is, and that it's correct, but I don't ever remember those things. Uh, but now I know too. I still get 15, 1600 emails a week. Not all of them are submissions to Cosmoetica. There are some spams. I'm on. Everyone sends me shit. But even recently, I got a young Zimbabwean poet that I think has some potential that I'd like to see some of his stuff. And it's interesting. Some people, will take criticism, and this isn't writing criticism, but personal criticism about poetry or about any other kind of writing or art they do, and they personalize it. I think I've called it the divine inspiration fallacy. That they believe that their demiurge comes from beyond them, and so if you say that's not good, you're attacking them. Or if you do something great and they're envious somehow, you've stolen something down from the music of the spheres that they could have had. And these are all of these kinds of things that you observe over the years. These silly kind of things, but it's always good with you and a handful of other people that I've encountered online. That have taken something. That's always the thing with art. You want someone to not ape you, but to get the fundamentals, to get the tools. You want to be able to give someone a spade and a hoe. You don't want to do their garden for them. And I think that's one of the things with you. Now let's get to the criticism aspect of it. What do you think is the most valuable tool that you've learned? If you just devolve, pin it down to one, either from Cosmoetica or my writings, and then we'll go on to in the next section and get back to the book.
Well, I think eventually, as far as criticism goes, by looking at your this old poem essays, and not looking at your revisions, but knowing that the original poem could be better in some way, I would try to sort of come to an understanding of what makes good art good art. And eventually, this came with a number. I wouldn't say rules or anything like that, but it came with a number of guidelines as to how this could be accomplished. And when I'm in a phase where I'm writing poetry versus writing prose, I walk down the street and I see certain things. I hear conversations, or I could be watching something or reading something. I interpret phenomena in the way of, can this somehow be formed into a poem? So sometimes there's some kind of experience that immediately strikes me as, this is a great blueprint for a poem. And this is something that has taken me a while. It's both a matter of allowing instinct to run free, and it's also a matter of allowing these kinds of guidelines that you formed in your head to actually shape things in a way that you could articulate beyond mere instinct. So as far as the tools from Cosmoetica, after a while of learning these kinds of guidelines, you're either going to be the type of person that could internalize them and can understand it intellectually and can use it, or you're going to be somebody that misses everything, no matter how much you're taught the same thing over and over again. And fortunately, I was in the former category, and it's become a matter of both instinct and articulation as well.
Let me
You need both.
Yeah, let me just end with the thing. We talked about it, but I want people who are listening to your interview here. I've often said that people should approach art more as a verb than a noun. And what I've meant about that is the way that something is communicated is the art, not like Rosenbaum, not some ism, not a feminist or a Marxist approach to something. Do you generally agree with that? And just give your own opinion, and then we'll move on to the next section.
I think the issue of art being either a noun or a verb, you could really consider it both as long as you don't get confused about what that really entails. So, many people that consider art, in the noun sense, they would sort of look at a poem or they would look at a film as something that cannot be penetrated, that is really what it sounds like, a thing, and a thing that denotes something that they can't really enter into. As far as approaching art as a thing to be done, this is the correct way, because if you look at content or philosophy or whatnot, there could be bad writing with great ideas. There could be bad ideas that are really well written. It really kind of goes both ways, and finding the intermediate is really where art is. Art is the confluence of these sorts of things. It's not merely one or the other, but if you don't have a way to properly do this, you're not going to have art, in the same way that if you have no ideas whatsoever, you won't have art either.
Okay. We're going to wrap up this interview in just a few minutes here. I wanted to ask the inevitable question, because a lot of people who are going to read this, or rather watch this video, or read Alex's book, are probably going to say, why was there so little talked about Woody and Mia, and Woody and the young girl, I don't remember her name, that he's allegedly molested? Yeah, Dylan Farrow, and the whole thing with Soon Yi and whatnot. And how can you write a book to support this pedophile, this terrible man, or whatnot? And let's just talk briefly about your idea, your take on the Woody Mia and the Dylan Farrow thing, how that differs from, say, the Roman Polanski thing, who he's often compared to, and how can you do a book on this evil human being?
Well, I could do a book on this evil human being because, as you can tell by the interview and the subject of my book, I must be an evil human being. Um, the whole thing with Woody Allen and Dylan Farrow, I've done a large amount of research, both pro and con, on the topic. Tell you the truth, I don't even know why I did it. I don't really care all that much. But essentially, I've come away with the idea that Woody Allen probably did not sexually abuse this girl. But the deeper issue is, I don't, on a personal level, I don't really care all that much. I'm not writing this book and saying this stuff about Woody Allen to be his friend. He's not somebody that I see in the street. He's not somebody that I am friendly with. This is me looking at his films. This is me engaging with his artwork. This is me engaging with his life's work. Whatever he might or might have not have done in his personal life is completely irrelevant to me. This is why in the book I take his biographical stuff and I put it to the very end of the book. That makes a statement. The statement is, it's irrelevant to me. I'm not here to gossip. The book is not a gossip rag. And that's really what it comes down to. As far as issues of Roman Polanski and whatnot, people look at Woody Allen's interactions with Soon Yi, that he started as a 50-plus-year-old man. He started dating a girl that was either 19 or 21 at the time. I don't remember the age. As an indication that he's into younger girls, and maybe that would have some sort of carryover to Dylan Farrow. But the fact is, being interested in women as a 50-year-old who are 30 years 30 years younger than you, that is an act of personal immaturity. It means that you're not really able to handle relationships with women in the way that you ought to handle them. That by itself is an immature and silly act, but it's not a sociopathic one. When you talk about things like the sexual abuse of a 7-year-old, that is a sociopathic act. It's not one of mere immaturity. The fact that people could easily conflate the two as if there's some relationship, it's just very, very silly. Say what you will about Woody Allen's personal choices, his personal life, the way that he fucked up relationships or not, whatever it may be. That may be true. That does not necessarily mean that he's a sociopath. It simply means that he's done things in his life that have been immature. That's not, that's not the same thing that he's being charged with, however.
Yeah, and even, of course, if he was guilty of everything he was claimed, or Roman Polanski too, who admitted to drugging and raping a girl. That
Mm.
again is divorced from his art. I mean, some of the great
Yeah.
artists are scumbags. Rainer Maria Rilke, one of the greatest published poets out there, was a terrible father. He was a louse and an adulterer, and Caravaggio was a murderer. The great painter Caravaggio. Um, that's again not supporting them. So anyway, let me just ask two things. Again, give us your the book's name, its price, when it's coming out, the press name, and when and that so people can buy it when it comes out.
The book is Woody Allen, Reel to Reel. The press name is Take Two Publishing, and I'm not completely sure of the price yet, but it will be under $10.
Okay, and that's a good. I've read the book. It's a hefty book as it is. As he said, it's about 150,000 words, and it's going to be about a month and a half. November 13th, I think, was the release date. So, uh, let me just the final thing. Let me just give you a minute or two, Alex, to wrap up this first Dan Schneider video interview with whatever you want to say about the book or yourself or anything else.
Well, doing this research for the book, among other things, one thing that stuck out for me is how often critics are just so repetitive. They're such copycats of each other. One person that I knew in high school that has now become a film critic, he told me at one point that he considers himself a mediocre writer and a mediocre critic. And I asked him, if you're a mediocre critic and a mediocre writer, why are you offering criticism to the world? Why are you even doing this thing? And his answer, which to me was very, very silly, very stupid, was because I can't sing, dance, or act. This is not the proper way to live life. Whether you're a janitor or whether you're a scientist, a great artist, whatever, you have a purpose, you have something to do, and you could either do it well or not well. It makes no sense to fight against the inevitable. It is of no service to the world if you think yourself as a bad writer and you do it anyway simply because you want to. Because there's so much bad writing out there. There's so much bad criticism out there. There are too many people that are confused about art. There are too many otherwise intelligent and potentially talented human beings that get completely derailed from any proper trajectory simply because of this massive bad writing and bad ideas and bad whatever. Do not add to this kind of noise. If you have something to say, then you say it. If you feel like you're like anybody else, stick to something that you could actually be good at and you could actually not only feel good about in the more personal sense, but actually offer as a service to the rest of the world. This is why I'm doing it. I'm not doing this for my ego. I don't necessarily enjoy doing film criticism or writing these kinds of essays, but hey, there's not been a book like this written. There's not been this kind of length and depth. But here I am. I'm able to do it. And for me to say no, that would be personal immaturity. That would be personal irresponsibility. And I'm not going to add to that. So
Yeah.
for everybody else, stick to your purpose. Live within your purpose. Do the best in what you can actually do. Do not fight against the inevitable because that's just stupid.
It reminds me what your friend, the critic, said. A friend of mine once said that the reason he thinks a lot of bad artists, wannabes, do poetry instead of painting or dance or whatnot is it's easy to just get a pencil and paper. And I think he was probably right. Well, thank you again, Alex Sheremet. This was the first Dan Schneider video interview recorded on September 27th, 2014 with Alex Sheremet, writer, poet, film critic, author of the forthcoming ebook Woody Allen Reel to Reel. Again, thank you, Alex. And for our readers, stay tuned for further interviews. This first one with Alex was just the beginning. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, man.